Well, I am Frosty Walker. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Texas Education Agency. And we are presenting today the third in a series of webinars regarding cybersecurity for the spring semester of 2019. Today we'll be covering key elements of effective risk management. We hope you find this to be informative. We will allow time at the end of the presentation for question and answers. Should you have a question during the presentation, feel free to submit them and we'll queue them up for the question and answer session. Always like to take the opportunity to talk about our Data Security Advisory Committee that we put together about 4 years ago. That committee provides guidance to the education communities in Texas, maximizing collaboration and communication regarding information security and cybersecurity issues and resources which can be utilized within the education communities we serve here in Texas. The DSAC is currently comprised of representatives from school districts, ESCs, TEA, and the private sector. If anyone that's listening today would be interested in participating in that, we meet once a month for about an hour. We have diversity both in size and geographically across the state, and all that we ask is that you be willing to share needs and ideas and some time to hopefully provide solutions to everyday cybersecurity issues that you're seeing in the school districts. I want to thank everyone that participates on that for their time and efforts, and we will continue to do that. Thank you very much for those that have participated. One of the things that we do when we talk about issues, we try to find solutions. And when we find solutions, then we post them on the Texas Gateway at https://www.texasgateway.org under Cybersecurity Tips and Tools. If you were to go to that URL, you would see featured resources, and you could find Cybersecurity Tips and Tools is indeed one of our featured resources. And in there, you will find recordings of all the webinars. Today's webinar will be recorded, and it will be placed out there in a few days. But we have done 14 other webinars prior to this one. And so there's lots of webinars regarding cybersecurity. We also have the Texas Cybersecurity Framework is out there. There are risk assessments out there. There are resources where you can get free cybersecurity training. We have some templates for cybersecurity policies that are there that if you're missing a policy, you can go out and find that type of information that you could easily modify for your school district. So we try to create a lot of valuable resources regarding cybersecurity and sharing information for the school districts. But today's topic is about risk assessments. And risk assessments, when we start looking at risk assessment models, and whether we're talking about risk assessments for cybersecurity or whether we're talking about risk assessments for natural disasters, or whether we talk about risk assessments just while we're driving. There's all kinds of different models out there that we can try to take advantage of. But some of those models can be a little bit scary if you take a look at them. For example, this particular model, it's a little difficult to understand. I'm not sure where you start. It looks like maybe you start at the lower left corner, and then you move forward. I really like the statement here. We can derive probability that isn't too wrong. So I don't think we're going to work on this model today. I don't like the term that isn't too wrong. Here's another model. This one is actually called the value chain model of risk assessment. And once again, it's hard to tell where you start and where you're going to finish. And So this makes it a little confusing when we start talking about risk assessment. Here's one I really like. It is called the comprehensive risk management model. And with that, you can looks like it determines you have SMART objectives. Now, I'm not sure if you start with SMART objectives on this or you finish with SMART objectives, because I couldn't tell where this started. So you have to be careful about what types of models you're looking for when you look at doing risk assessments. Now, I'm a pretty simple guy, and I actually like this risk model, the analytical risk model. Been around a long time. It contains 5 major steps with a monitor and a report. And we're going to cover each one of these steps in detail today, and we'll talk more in detail about those in a moment. But first of all, it talks about setting your risk management strategy. So we'll talk more about the strategy of what we're actually trying to do when we're going to do a risk assessment. The second step is establish context. What are we really going to evaluate on the risk? Do we set parameters? We'll identify the key risk within those parameters. Then we're going to do a score exposure, and we're going to see if we can reduce our exposure. And then we're going to monitor that, generate a report, and from time to time, we're going to need to come back and revisit that risk assessment. And so in this model, it makes it fairly simple to follow that flow. So that's one of the main reasons that I like this. It's pretty simple. It's not too complicated. It works with whether we're doing this for incumbent weather, natural disasters, cybersecurity. It works just about on anything that we're going to evaluate risk on. So I think it's overall universal in trying to provide us some guidance when we're looking at doing risk assessments. And when I start talking about risk assessments, people go, I do not like doing risk assessments. But the reality is we do risk assessments all the time. We're driving down the street and we're looking in our rearview mirror. That's a risk assessment. We're watching traffic on both sides of us. Those are risk assessments. We're looking at the traffic in front of us. We're evaluating all of those things and potentially looking at actions that we can do. So we really do these all the time. We just don't think about risk assessments as being a risk assessment. So in the model that we've chosen to talk about today, the analytical risk assessment model, we talk about the very first thing you want to do is to set some strategy. And it's imperative for a task to guide the response to uncertainties, both the risk and the opportunities, and requires a clear understanding of the strategy and the risk executing in that strategy. The risk management strategy should identify how the risks are going to be identified, how they're going to be managed, and including the roles of the different actors. So while we're used to doing risk assessments on our own, when we start talking about risk assessments within our entities, within our schools, within our agencies, we're typically not able to perform those by ourselves. And so in this model, it allows for us to identify the roles and who those actors are going to be, who we need to include to make sure that we've done an efficient risk assessment. So when we talk about roles, we're going to talk about who is responsible for maintaining the records and managing the escalation. So if someone is managing the risk and is maintaining the records, it's probably not going to be the same person that we need to manage escalation. Who are we going to escalate that to if we feel like that the risk is greater than something has changed? So what is our strategy of escalation? So we've got to have at least multiple people involved. Whose agreement is required for risk to be finalized? Who is going to sign off on this? Many cases like this, we will see if we're doing a full-blown risk assessment, they will establish a governance board that would take a look at that would consist of in our case, when we're dealing with cybersecurity, that would consist of someone that's familiar with cybersecurity, maybe someone from our network, someone from IT, someone from divisions or with administration. So we would include all of those functions within a governance group to make sure that project is on task and doing what it's supposed to do. So another thing that we would consider is to whom are those risks escalated and what is their responsibility in helping manage that risk. So if it's escalated, and it's escalated to me, for example, what am I really supposed to do? Do I need to take some action? And those need to be defined in this early stage in setting the parameters with the strategy. Another thing that we'll talk about in this first phase is our process and standards. What kind of standards and processes and other structure will govern the risk management for this strategy. If I'm just doing a risk assessment for myself, I can easily pull those standards in. But once I'm doing it with other folks, we have to agree to make sure that everybody knows the standards, the procedures and structures that govern this process. We're going to need to talk about frequency. How often, so once we complete this risk assessment, how often are we going to go back and review this risk assessment? Because risks change all the time. Opportunities change all the time. What's impacted by an event can change. So we want to do a risk assessment. If you're going to start a risk assessment, you want to monitor that from time to time. Is that once every 2 years? Is that once a year? Is that every 6 months? That depends. But again, you want to set those standards. I can relate this back to the Texas cybersecurity framework that I've worked with here at the TEA agency for a long time now. The state requires me to turn that into DIR every 2 years, but I refresh that every month right now because I have a lot of security activity that we're implementing. So I'm refreshing that every month so that I can get a better understanding of if I've missed any gaps. But at the same time, the state also requires me to have someone come in and audit, and basically they do a third party does a full risk assessment for me every 2 years as well. So those are some examples of risk assessment and how they might be practical in the cybersecurity field and what I actually experience here at Texas Education Agency. And later we'll talk about that in more detail. We also want to talk while we're setting strategy, cooperation. What are the expectations of the risk assessments regarding required and optional risk information? How should preparation for the risk assessment exercise be done? How should reporting on implementing mitigations and significant risk events and how are they supposed to be reported? We look back, hindsight is great vision, but we look back and we'll talk a little bit more about Harvey and the impact that had on so many of our Texas school districts. we look at the risk and frequency of an event like that. So we'll talk more about those risk and events and how that can change. And of course, reporting. We talk about reporting and who are we going to report that to, and how are we going to keep all the parties informed of the key risk that's necessary for good governance and essential for transparency. So again, those are we'll talk in a moment about where we're going to store those reports. If it contains confidential information, how is that going to be maintained? How frequently are the risks reported, and again, to whom? A collection and use of the information needs to be described, and a division of labor established. Again, we talked about roles and actors early on in this strategy, as well as who will the collected information be shared with. Well, all of those parameters need to be set, and particularly if we're dealing with confidential information, because we have to make sure that there's a need for someone to know that confidential information if it's included in a risk assessment such as this. So as you can see, step one is more about strategy and how we're going to, who's going to be involved, how's it going to be governed, how often are we going to revisit and monitor this again, trying to set some parameters around that. Once we start talking about context, then we're getting more into more details about the risk assessments itself. So establishing the content, both internal or external, we need to focus on gaining an understanding of the topic and the associated risk in preparation for the assessment. For example, we may want to pull documentation. What documentation do we actually have to support potential risk? Or do we do gap analysis in that? Or and we want to establish the scope of the risk assessment being undertaken, and for developing a structure and establishing a scope is very critical, primarily because a project can continue to incur scope creep, and so the project gets stretched out longer and longer, and eventually you've lost focus on what the original intent was. So you want to establish that scope of the risk assessment and try to stay with that scope and avoid scope creep if at all possible. The context of the risk assessment may include confirming the purpose and the objectives of the risk assessment, setting scope and boundaries, identifying possible critical links between the risk and scope and other activities. So while you may want to define that as to where here's my scope, but that scope may impact other activities. You see that often when you do disaster recovery exercises. Again, that's a risk. And you begin to say, well, I never thought that would impact this. So you have to look at those things. Becomes very, while you define what's in scope, you can look at the impact of other activities that are involved. You're going to define and limit the preliminary research and analysis to be done, setting the methodology, and confirming the management arrangements, resources and a timetable. All of those can be established within the context in step 2 of this process. In step 3, we start to really identify key risk and gather information on historical incidents and emerging issues pertaining to the subject. It can include specific information as well as general information that's under assessment. Gathering this information may be obtained from various sources: internal incident data, results of audits, staff interviews, group discussions, questionnaires, open source data. There's a lot of different places that you can go to gather that information regarding your risk. So when we're identifying those key risks, we'll talk a little bit about your risk source, and that describes the nature of the risk, which is inherent potential to harm or facilitate harm. This is where, if we were looking at doing disaster recovery, we would talk about potential acts of natural disaster. We look at hindsight. We look at Harvey. How are we going to know that we would have a hurricane that would come ashore on the Texas shores, bounce off, come back in, bounce off, come back in, and wind up, dropping 48 inches of rain over thousands of square miles of the Texas shoreline and impacting school districts all, for hundreds of miles, and not just impacting school districts, but impacting, the population. People, their homes were no longer in existence. It was a tremendous catastrophe, and we'll look at some of that. But when we look at an event like Harvey, it may never happen again, or it could happen again this summer. We just don't know. So we have to look at the nature of the risk and what the potential harm is. The risk outcome. What could happen if the risk materializes? Events or incidents that could occur whereby the source of the risk or the threat has an impact to achieve objectives. The same thing is true here when we look at a cybersecurity risk, such as ransomware. Should one of our school districts incur ransomware and have their data encrypted, that can shut a school system down for days. What is the impact if we had such an event? And how can we want to look at how would we prevent those from happening? And again, there's never an assurance that we can 100% prevent anything from happening, but we'll talk again later as we start talking about mitigation of those risks for those things. We talk about where can it happen, physical locations, and where the event could occur, whether it's direct or indirect consequences that may be experienced. What we saw with Harvey was both direct and indirect consequences. It was just a major event, and hopefully we never experience that in Texas again. When can it happen? There are specific times and periods when this event is likely to occur and circumstances realized. In this case, we're talking about natural disaster, hurricanes. We have a hurricane season. We understand that. It runs from June to the 1st of November when the Gulf waters heat up and potentially produce those types of storms. So there are time frames that we look at, whether it's a natural disaster or in the case of cybersecurity, that those can happen anytime. So step 4 in this risk model is to assess the risk and score exposures. The risk is assessed as part of due diligence process, and we will talk a lot about due diligence as we move forward in this presentation. And processing, taking into account the risk and commensurate due diligence measures. Risk is analyzed in the context of the impact on the achievement objectives, and the results of the risk assessment forms the basis to manage the risk. For risk management to be effective, results based on management roles, responsibility, delegations to project managers need to be formalized. So when we talked about step one, and developing a strategy, this last sentence kind of sums that up. Risk management to be effective, results based on management roles, responsibility, and delegations. I think that is a very good summary of step one. Now, for folks that may have been involved in risk assessments in the past, this chart is probably something that you've seen many times. I've seen this chart many times, and I've had people walk into my office and say, we're starting a risk assessment, and here's how we're going to measure this. You can see on the bottom, it's the likelihood versus the severity that would result from that event happening. And it always surprises me that they've skipped 3 steps. We've already moved to measuring the risk. So we need to think about that whole process. It would be great to start here at this point. And if you have a list of risk and have identified those, then you may be ready to start at this point, or you may have to start back at point 1. But the whole concept of this chart is to identify the actions that would need to be taken. So you look at it across the bottom. Is it improbable? That's a 1. Remote, 2. Occasional, 3. Probable, 4. Frequent, 5. And the same thing is for severity, starting at the bottom, is negligible, low, moderate, significant, and catastrophic. So an event that would happen that was catastrophic and could happen frequently would end up in the red zone, potentially, with a 25. Anything that's in the red zone in this particular chart says it needs to escalate to the board. And that's not necessarily the school board, that is your governance board, because if we've got a catastrophic rating, that means that it potentially could occur, either is very highly likely or could occur frequently and would be catastrophic or at least significant. We need to take not just immediate action, but we need the board to review that action. Anything that's in the color of more like an orange here, are scores of 15, would require urgent action. Anything that scores in the yellow, that's 8, 9, 10, or 12. Those scores would require action, and we would develop an action plan for that. We also have the ability to see that we have acceptable or monitor. That's a 4, 5, and 6 range on this chart. And desirable is no action, a 1, 2, or 3. We really don't have to take any action on that if this risk rates, when we multiply the likelihood times the severity, if it's a 1, 2, or 3, it recommends no action. Again, you might change those processes if you felt like that something could happen that's outside the normal range for that activity. We'll talk a little bit more about the scoring. For those that like me, who are actually maybe colorblind, ratings 1, 2, and 3 would require no actions. 4, 5, and 6 is you would monitor that risk. 8, 9, 10, and 12, you do need to take action. A score of 15 would be urgent action would be required, and 16 or higher is escalate that to the board for proper action, because it's going to require immediate attention. So once that we've actually rated our risk, now we want to try to see how we can talk about reducing that risk, or actions that we're going to take. And there are basically 4 treatment options for risk. You have choices that you can take no action at all beyond what you already have implemented. No additional control mechanism, other than what you already have in place. And that would be an acceptable risk. Oftentimes we accept risk. You're driving down the road and there's cars all around you, and there's not really anything you can do. You're gonna accept the fact that you're in heavy traffic. You put yourself on extra guard, hopefully, while you're in that situation, in that traffic. So you accept that. A risk can be controlled by engaging mitigation actions to reduce serious risk to the acceptable level. So you can control or reduce or eliminate that risk. And in cybersecurity, we oftentimes implement firewalls, set up control access lists that reduce some of that risk. We never eliminate risk altogether. There's always a risk factor involved, but we can put in controlling actions that would reduce the risk to where it's a more acceptable level. There's also another way that we can manage that risk, and that is we can try to avoid it. Typically doesn't work well when we're dealing with natural weather events, hurricanes, tornadoes, bad storms. We can't avoid those. In cybersecurity, a lot of times because we have websites, we can't avoid cybersecurity risks. But that is one of the risk treatments that could be applied in many other cases of risk. And the last way that we can manage risk options is to transfer or share that risk with someone else. And we'll talk more about these 4 levels of risk treatment. So when we talk about accept or retain risk, that's without any need for any mitigation measures. We're doing an adequate job in controlling that risk. We make a decision that it will tolerate that as long as the risk doesn't change, and potentially, there's no cost associated with that. Risk retention can also be seen as accepting the losses as well as a benefit of opportunity for taking action. All risks that are not avoided or transferred are retained by default. So at least now that if you have a risk and you're using these four treatments, you either, if you avoid it or you transfer that risk, those are actions, but otherwise you're either going to, by default, you're going to accept that risk, or you're going to mitigate that risk. As we talk about mitigation of risk, this is implementing a control to reduce that risk. And you want to reduce it to an acceptable level. So now I can actually, if I implement those types of controls, that becomes an acceptable risk. Includes prescriptions such as preventive, corrective, directive, detective. Reducing the risk involves a reduction in the likelihood the risk would occur, as well as a reduction of the severity should the risk materialize. In the IT world, so we use intrusion detection. We use firewalls. We use secure portals. We do a lot of different things trying to reduce the risk to protect our data. And so this is most often is the treatment that we see ourselves doing, is taking actions to reduce that risk. But of course, you first have to identify it. And as we said, the last treatment, well, actually, this is not the last treatment. The next treatment, the third treatment, is to avoid that treatment. Like we said, in many circumstances, depending on the risk, you can avoid that risk. But in the case of cybersecurity and information security, in today's realm, this is typically not a treatment that we use to control or manage a risk for cybersecurity issues. And the last treatment is to transfer or share, which means we either outsource or we insure. And those two are very, we see that common within information technology, and certainly within cybersecurity. Finding a financial solution paid to a third party to handle the risk. Cybersecurity insurance. The decision is made to subcontract, involve other parties based on the structural risk to operate with lower risk. I can outsource that IT processing to someone else, and so I'm transferring that risk. When we transfer the risk, we've reduced our risk, but we're still responsible at the end of the day. We still have the responsibility to protect that data. So we're transferring it to someone else, and we're setting up in a contractual contract that here's the way that we want this data to be protected. So that's a common occurrence that we do today, is that we outsource that for someone else, and we look at cybersecurity insurance as a way to evaluate that. This last week, I saw a presentation made by the Colorado Department of Transportation that was in the news at the end of 2018 regarding that they had a major ransomware attack that shut their operation down completely for about 10 days. They were able to restore from backups all of their data. They spent about $2 million in recovering from that cyber attack. One of the questions that was asked was, did you have cyber insurance? And the answer was, we didn't when this happened. We do now. So, they not only look at, what it costs them to restore in that cyber attack, but also they wanted to make sure that they were able to share that risk with someone so they chose to take out insurance. So those are some examples of what happens when you transfer or share risk in the cybersecurity environment. Now, we define step number 6, monitoring and report risk. One of the important components of monitoring is to ensure that the threats are adequately constrained and opportunities are appropriately taken to reduce uncertainty. Monitoring the treatment actions should be planned part of the risk management process. will involve regular review where the results are recorded and reported internally. And if you need to report those externally, you may have to do that as well, depending on what type of risk assessment you're doing. If it's a cybersecurity risk assessment, that information is protected by state statute, and so you do not have to share that data externally. It benefits the risk management framework as well as a valuable input for continuous improvement. So once you've completed that, you can't put this back on the shelf and say, okay, I've done that, and we'll wait another 10 years. You want to continue to monitor that, and that was set back in the very first step. How often are we going to monitor that and report on that? Because things change. Your environment changes internally. Your exposure and new threats are constantly showing up when we're talking about cybersecurity and defenses. So it's key that we continue to monitor. Monitoring treatment actions should include effectiveness and efficiency of the controls. Are they working? Obtain information from various sources to mature and improve your risk assessment. Benefit from lessons learned from risk events, included near misses, changes, trends, successes, failures. All of those things need to be included when you're talking about monitoring, because particularly in cybersecurity, things change all the time. That's why we have patch Tuesdays with Microsoft. You patched last month, and you think we applied all our patches, everything's good, and 30 days later, things change. So we have to constantly be monitoring those changes in the external environment, changes in the internal environment, to risk and risk criteria, to the risk may need periodic updating and revisions, identification of emerging risk and trends, all very applicable to cybersecurity. Now, I said we would talk more about due diligence, and I created a whole slide to talk about due diligence within the content of risk management. The overall framework in managing risk and identifying due diligence mechanisms need to take into account areas that are clear with thresholds. For example, financial, procurement, delegations of authority, and the areas where quantitative thresholds are not possible. So we want to look at all of those realms. When we start talking about due diligence, while we say we want to be, it's like scoring on a test. 100 would be great, but due diligence could be a score of 80, whereas passing is 70. You make a B, that's above a C. So due diligence could be established that a score of a B on a test would be very similar to establishing a due diligence mark. Due diligence is a component of comprehensive risk management, which encompasses policies and procedures, guidance, tools, techniques in the areas of operation. When we talk about the Texas Cybersecurity Framework, we talk about due diligence should be a score of 3.0. That was something that was established by Gartner Research for state and local governments, which included schools. 3.0, that may not be obtainable right away. So you might want to set your due diligence at a 275. You could do that with the intent that once you got everything scoring, say a 275, you move it to a 3. I'm always trying to see, can I push my due diligence a little further? I'm never on a scale of 0 to 5 on the Texas framework. I'm never going to score 100 in all 40 of the objectives, but I can establish that due diligence that I think I can score that in. So again, due diligence is measures refer to common measures that can be applied to the strategy. And these are complementary to already established measurements that are adhered to by your organization. So while we say a standard on the Texas Cybersecurity Framework is 3.0, again, you may set that higher. You may set that a little lower so you can achieve that a little faster so that you can move that. Due diligence is something that you establish within your organization. So with that, we are going to turn now to our questions. I have a couple of questions that we have here. I have some folks that would like to participate in the DSAC. I will drop you an email informing you of the next meeting, and we'll add you to that list. Thank you very much for that. Where can we find the Texas Cybersecurity Framework? It is at the Texas Gateway. Attachments are at the very bottom of that page. So if you look for cybersecurity, Texas Cybersecurity Framework or Information Security Plan, you will find that framework there on the Texas Gateway. If you can't find it there, drop me an email. I'll send you out a copy. With that, we have a framework that shows all 40 of those objectives, and it's a self-assessment. You score things from 0 to 5. Those objectives, very seldom do you have 100% at one level. You'll probably have some things at 50% and a 2 and a 50% and a 3, something like that. It allows you to do that, and it creates a graph. And then you can draw a line in it for your due diligence and see where you're at on all 40 of those. So that's a very good tool. The reason that we brought up the Texas Cybersecurity Framework, we have lots of bills that are being pended by legislation regarding schools and regarding cybersecurity, but one of those bills does require the schools to offer or to appoint a cybersecurity coordinator. Requires them schools to maintain and develop and maintain the cybersecurity framework that higher education uses, which is that's out there. And it also would require you to report cybersecurity incidents back to TEA. Whether that particular bill passes or not, we should know in the next 30 days or so. The session wraps up around the 1st of June. So we'll know what the legislation is expecting from us for the next 2 years. I'm looking to see if I have any other questions, and I don't at this time. So with that, looks like we can actually give everybody back a few minutes of time today. We appreciate everyone's attendance. We'll get the webinar posted and the video available here in the next few days out on the Texas Gateway. And with that, I certainly wish everybody a great day, and thank you very much for your attendance. Have a great day. Thank you.